All right, what's up, everyone? Welcome back. So we have got quite a few updates here for Dune Awakening since our last video. Tons to go over here, including interviews, previews, and best of all, a bunch of raw gameplay footage. Finally, yes, we can see the game running in action. And you know what? Being an in-development survival game, probably no surprise here, it's got some rough edges, without question. Melee combat in particular looks a tad janky, and this has been one of the biggest early points of feedback that I've seen. And we've also already gotten a developer response, which we will get into later in the video. The TLDR, it's a work in progress, right? Now, on that same note, they even prefaced the gameplay reveal by saying Dune Awakening is still in beta. It's got plenty more work to be done prior to its release in 2025. So we will continue to hang tight and see what further polishing they do in the coming months. But I'll add, even with these rough edges, generally, I like what I saw. I do. As a fan of survival games, pretty much every one I've ever played has some level of jank, and this doesn't look too far off the mark from what I am used to seeing. In fact, I think a lot of it looks pretty solid. The environments and points of interest are really cool looking. Even though Dune's setting is primarily the desert, they've clearly made some efforts to have some variety in the spaces we'll be exploring. They've got quite a few interesting systems and game mechanics in here. I think the base building and crafting systems look great. I love what they've shown of the PvE experience with clearing enemy camps and the dungeon diving. This stuff looks awesome, honestly. The ornithopter flight seemed well done, and while the melee combat does look rough, I thought the shooting appeared to at least have a decent foundation. And I also quite like the variety of spells and special abilities we're gonna have access to that they've showcased, and the movement options between the climbing, the grapple hook, and the grav belts. Like, zipping around this environment looks really cool. They certainly still have got work to do before Dune Awakening comes out, but it does appear to be shaping up pretty nicely. At the very least, I am still looking forward to playing it. All right, so let's jump into all the new stuff here. I'm going to start with the gameplay overview, as I'm sure that's what many of you are interested in. So this began with us checking out character creation. Now, we've already seen this a few times, but the basics are you start off by picking the look of your character, and it seems like there's a fair bit of customization options within that. But most importantly, you select your mentor, which is basically picking your starting class, choosing between the Swordmaster, Bene Gesserit, Mentat, and Trooper. And all this determines is your starting abilities. Later down the road, you are able to specialize however you like. You can use skills from any of the other classes, which is good. Now, after this, they then moved into the tutorial. The player waking up in a cave after crash landing gets the basics of movement, combat, and survival, which is helped in part by gaining access to a Frem kit. So this is basically your early game and on-the-go crafting and survival mechanism. It is a backpack as well as a field kit that, after gathering certain resources, this will let you make some of these starter weapons, tools, and consumables while you're out on the go. Now, leaving the tutorial, we are then shown some of the more advanced survival and crafting systems, like the fact that spending too much time walking on the sands calls the sandworms. You want to avoid that, or that you have to stay out of the heat to avoid dehydration and specifically sunstroke. And they showcase what happens if you don't avoid it. You get this debuff, and then you'll lose water reserves even faster if you are in sunstroke. They even have pockets of the world with heavy amounts of spice in the air, and if you don't have the proper resistances or tolerance, spending too much time here will actually debilitate you, which is interesting. We even see some of the interactive harvesting. This is one of the nice touches that they have in the game. So you've got basic harvesting. You know, you go around picking up items or resources on the ground. You sort of just vacuum them up. But then they've got the more advanced harvesting for larger resources and scrap metal nodes, where it has a mini game. Using your cutting ray, you have to trace along some shape or line, and then doing so properly gives you extra resources. It's just, again, a nice little extra touch to what is just resource harvesting. Now, after this section, they then moved into combat, showing several sequences with a few different characters taking on an enemy base. And I gotta say, this is the sort of content that I really enjoy about open world games. So first, we see a character climbing up high above a base onto these rock formations. The game's got a free climbing system, so as long as you have the stamina, you're able to climb anywhere in the environment. They then, from the top, mark the enemy camp with binoculars, stored a Far Cry style. And then, and I really liked this, they were able to quickly close the gap using this mixture of a grapple hook and suspensor belt, which lets them launch up and propel forward, carrying the momentum as they glide. And I can tell just by looking at this that it's going to be a lot of fun to play around with, zipping around the environment, approaching NPC bases like this, or even other players in PvP scenarios from all these varied directions. I mean, I think this movement and this world traversal also looks really good. So now closer to the base, we see the player crafting their starter weapon known as a Mala pistol, which they use in conjunction with some grenades to take out several patrolling enemies around the camp. And I know this might be overdone to some people, but I gotta say, I still get a kick out of clearing enemy camps in open world games, so I really hope they've got a ton of them in Dune Awakening. It's simple, but really fun, especially if stealth is an option, which it looks like it might be. But even not in stealth, again, using things like the zipping around with the grapple hook and the glide, taking out enemies while you're soaring in the air and then zipping up to a higher elevation to take out more enemies. It just looks really cool. Like, yes, there's definitely some pretty stiff animations here. I'm not blind, I see it, and I hope they continue to improve it. But overall, just the general process of going into these camps and clearing them with all this movement and your abilities and your range weapons, I think it looks pretty cool. So after a couple of minutes of the range combat, they then swap to a melee focused character, and this is kind of where it goes off the rails a bit. Like, this looks pretty rough without question. Really stiff animations, even stiffer and less fluid than the prior combat animations. Now, as I mentioned earlier though, the developer has already addressed this, and here's what they said. Our melee system is a parry and dodge based with slow and fast attacks to be accurate with the lore, and yes, what you see in the gameplay presentation is the first iteration of combat as we overhauled it recently in the closed beta. We are continuing to iterate on it on subsequent beta updates right until launch and beyond. We already had experience with melee systems thanks to Exiles, so we decided to focus on aspects we haven't had that much experience before, such as the range/gunplay and the vehicles/flying. This is why you can see in the footage gunplay and vehicle handling have a more finished look. Other aspects we are working to get ready for launch levels are animations, optimization, and so on. This is part of the normal development roadmap and will look more polished as we approach launch. But yes, all of it is very much work in progress, not final, and directly taken from the beta build our testers are playing. We decided it was better and more honest to show footage as it is rather than embellishing it above what is available now, which I think is commendable. They're being honest with, hey, this is how the game's melee combat system looks right now. And all in all, that was a lot of words to say. This is an early iteration of melee combat, the first iteration evidently. They focused on polishing their other aspects of the gameplay, including the ranged and vehicles, which I do think look better. And then next they will be working on polishing melee more between now and release. And I absolutely hope they do, because yes, it doesn't look great right now, but also still seems like the range animations could use some additional work. So I'm assuming and hoping they're doing that as well. Now, outside of the specific animations and the stiffness of a lot of it, they did show some abilities as well, which I thought were neat. Like we saw a knee charge and riposte. With the knee charge in particular, I thought looked cool as the character kind of teleports towards the enemy and knees them straight in the face. And then next they swapped to a Mentak character and showed a couple of their abilities, including an area scan that highlights objects and enemies, along with the Hunter Seeker, which is like a drone that can one-shot basic enemies, evidently. They also showcased some of the blood extraction, which is a crude early form of hydration that can later be refined to avoid getting the debuffs that you get from drinking blood directly. And that pretty much wraps up the combat section. Next, it's on to base building. So the game uses a territory and blueprint system. You start off by placing down a sub-fief console, which acts as the territory and space in which you can build upon. This also comes with taxes, oh joy. And then once you have that down, you begin placing blueprints, or these holograms of whatever foundations, walls, roofs, and other building components you want. And those can be filled by yourself directly and immediately, or they can be filled later on by yourself or other players who bring the necessary resources. You can even copy a blueprint of an entire building that you make, saving its exact layout to quickly place down in other locations in the future, or you can sell those blueprints on the player marketplace to other players. They move to a later game instance showing what a finished base full of crafting stations could look like, interacting with a blood purifier to turn the blood to drinking water, walking past various resource processing stations and crafting, and then even going into a fabricator, which they used to construct a sand bike from scratch. After this, they moved on to show some of the open world exploration, the events and points of interest. Some cool stuff here included the crash ship events. So these you see literally falling from the sky. This is like real time. You see it falling, and then if you head to where the thing crashes, you will find a ship just broken into pieces with valuable resources all over the place for you to collect. The rub here, though, is that in a lot of cases, these will also be PvP flags, so you want to go in quickly and get away with your resources before other players show up to take you out and take it for themselves. During the nighttime, they've got these police forces, the security that will scan the planet from these ships looking for players, and if you are caught in one of their spotlights, they're actually going to temporarily lock you in place and then call down troops to your location. Both of these events, I think, look really cool and I hope they have a lot more variety and other things along these same lines. And then of course there is the sandworm. If you spend too much time on the sand making noise, it will draw the worms, and if they catch you, you are dead. Now why bother then? Well, because there's a lot of valuable resources out in the dunes, like flower sand and of course spice. So you want to go there, but you're gonna have to do so strategically and keep your head on a swivel. They then moved on to player hubs. The game's gonna be launching with 2 major cities from what we know. They gave us a sneak peek of one of them in the video, the Harkening hub of Harko Village. Player hubs will have all of the expected elements. You're gonna have vendor and quest NPCs. You'll see other people running around and you can chat and group up with them, form alliances. There's a marketplace where you can buy and sell goods with other players. And then the faction system plays into the cities where you're choosing to side with either the Harkonnen or the Atreides. And then we've got what was probably one of my favorite things that they showcased in this whole thing, which were the dungeons known as desert testing stations. Now these are predominantly underground and they will come in a wide variety of biome types, quite different from the sands above. That's because science things happen in these stations and science is basically magic. So you're gonna, even though we're on the desert planet of Dune, you're gonna be seeing a lot of plant life and different variety in these desert testing stations. And I think that was a great idea to mix up the experience. Now they've actually said that these areas, although they call them dungeons, they're less like traditional MMO dungeons and more along the lines of what you might get in like Fallout's shelters or the dungeons in Skyrim. There's gonna be a lot of narrative woven throughout these areas. As you go through, you'll find data pads or audio logs that give you a bunch of information and history about the area. And while they are going to be full of enemies in most cases and even have some sort of a boss encounter at the end, also these are bosses that might take, like if a normal enemy takes 5 to 10 seconds to take out, the bosses might take like 30 to 40 seconds. But it's not like 10+ minute World of Warcraft style dungeon boss encounters. That's not what they're going for here. And I think this sounds cool as it is. Now I would love the traditional structured MMO like dungeons as well, but I like this too. And I think between clearing those NPC bases above the sands and then going through these testing stations below, as long as there's a large quantity of both of these things, it all sounds like a fun time to me. In their showcase, we also saw a couple of new abilities here. We saw a player deploying portable cover that the team could crouch behind. And then we saw someone using a flamethrower, which is apparently good for taking out shields. And then at the end, they opened up a loot chest rewarding some resources and blueprints. And then lastly, they gave us the smallest brief glimpse of Dune Awakening's Endgame, which is all about the deep desert. So we see players scouting out a large spice blow in the distance. They then get in their vehicles, which include sandbikes, ornithopters, and crawlers. And then we saw some cinematic clips of a group of players fighting back other players for control of the spice. So this aspect of the game is what we've really seen the least about, and it sounds awesome on paper, but it's also one of my potentially biggest concerns. Like beyond the combat looking stiff, I think my biggest early worry for Dune Awakening is the fact that the end game is like 100% PvP focused. As of now, it's all about going into the deep desert and harvesting spice there. This is the most valuable resource in the game. It's used for a lot of things, and the entire deep desert region where you're doing this is full 100% PvP 100% of the time. So they have said that there's going to be no restrictions in terms of like balancing player numbers and groups of people coming together, as the zone is fully open, and barring them hitting server thresholds, any number of people can be in one location at a single time. So games that are like this almost without fail end up just turning into giant Zerg fest. It happens every time it's a possibility, with the winning side in most cases just being the group that has more people in it. Now Zerg versus Zerg balancing is one thing, but I'm really more concerned about the smaller groups or solo players if they're going to just be unable to do anything in the deep desert, and as such not really be able to participate in Dune Awakening's endgame. Now when I interviewed Joel Bylos, we talked about this, and there were two things that he mentioned about the deep desert. One, that it is massive, like humongous. It takes a very long time to traverse even by flying, and so there's going to be a lot of different areas to explore and a lot of space in between all of it. And B, because of how it's structured, these huge swaths of sand dunes with rock islands dotted throughout, this gives players huge sight lines as well to see other people coming to wherever they are. So theoretically, if you are a small group or solo player, you could run away before big groups get to you, and you could just avoid the PvP combat if you want, as long as you're paying attention. Beyond this though, my hope is that they have small pockets of spice blows or areas that maybe not worth it for those huge guilds of players to focus on, but the smaller groups of 2 to 3 people or the solo players can still go for and still engage in the end game, even if they're not doing the big group focus content. Otherwise, yeah, there's a chance that the deep desert being full of PvP with no player caps, it'll just be nothing but massive guilds of players running over everything. Now with that said, I also think it's entirely possible that once this game comes out, 99% of players don't even spend time in the deep desert, or maybe they go there a couple times, die, and never return. After all, the starting zone called Hagga Basin, this is the region we begin in after the tutorial, it is huge. They say it's larger than the entirety of their prior game, Conan Exiles, which that is already pretty big. Joel told me that he expects players to spend at least 50 to 60 hours in this region before they even think about being able to get access to the deep desert. So yeah, there is a good chance that a huge chunk of the player base around initial launch might spend all of their playtime in Hagga Basin, and then at which point it'll only be the hardcore, most dedicated players who graduate and progress into the deep desert. And then we know they're going to be adding additional regions in the game, and so maybe the third region beyond Hagga and deep desert, maybe that's a more PvE focused one, or one that splits the difference. We'll have to see. Now, that was the gameplay video, as well as my discussion about the end game. There's a couple of other things. There was also a 5-minute gameplay video revealed, which you would assume is just a condensed version of the 30-minute one, but no. While it does cover a lot of the same topics, it actually has very own unique footage in there, so we got to see a few different things here as well, which was nice. And then they held the third episode of the Dune Awakening Direct. Here's a few interesting tidbits from that. They say that the game has a full dynamic day-night cycle. Now, in order to stay out of the sun and avoid getting sunstroke, you're going to have to stick to the shadows during the day, and the location of those shadows are going to change dynamically as the sun moves through the sky. That's pretty cool. Now, beyond staying hydrated with your suit, you're also going to be able to craft mobile tents if you want to get out of the sun direct exposure in a pinch. Part of character progression is going to be these trials of the Fremen, which appear to take place in these spice-induced hallucinations. Pretty cool looking locations, kind of floating in the ether. This is also how you're going to unlock some special abilities and blueprints. There will be hidden treasure buried in the sand. You can locate these with the scanner, and then you can blow away the sand to uncover and retrieve them. They're going to have multiple building sets, so different visual appearances, including faction-specific buildings you can build. Spice in the game, it's the most important resource, especially come on game. Joel specified that this will be used for fueling generators in your base, for crafting the high-tier gear, for paying your taxes. You can also sell spice on the marketplace, and as you accumulate spice in your bloodstream, it's actually going to improve your class abilities, although they're being pretty vague on exactly how this works. Consuming spice is going to be part of character progression. Really interested to see this, how it works out. Class abilities, they said a big focus here is getting players into and out of combat, either moving your character around the environment towards characters, or displacing enemies by pulling them towards you or pushing them away. And then they also clarified that you don't have to pick a faction if you want to sort of act as a free agent. You don't want to fight for the Harkonnen or the Atreides, you can do so, although you would be missing out on certain things like faction rewards, including some gear. All right, so to wrap up, now that we've seen some extended real gameplay, I think this looks pretty well done for a survival game. Even if in its current state, it seems pretty fleshed out and more polished than what I'm used to from the genre. Now, definitely they need some animation work, especially the melee combat, and even some of the movement and shooting animations all feel a bit stiff, so I hope they make this more fluid and improve it coming up to release. But I think everything else about the game looks pretty darn good, and so I'm really praying that it feels good to play, because if so, I could definitely see myself enjoying this game. I love the premise, I love the different points of interest and activities, I love the variety of settings that they've shown, more than I was expecting from a desert planet game, and I love their traversal system. I'm so glad they went with this free movement, able to climb anything. You got a grapple hook and levitation belt, essentially. This alone could be a lot of fun to mess around with. I just envision going up to enemy camps, grapple hooking, and then you propelling with the momentum and zipping around and flying and shooting. Like, that whole process could be a ton of fun. If there's a high density of enemies, if there's a lot of these camps, if they're really big camps in conjunction with those dungeons, it just seems like it could be a fun game to play as long as it feels good and those animations get some improvements. All right, well, that is it for today. I will be back with some more updates for sure the next time we've got a big round of information and reveals. Or ideally, if I get the chance to play the game and an NDA is lifted, I really would like to cover it as well. Now, they have said Dune Awakening is targeting an early 2025 release, so that means it should be out sometime in the next 6 months. But beyond that, they're also planning to ramp up testing and let more people into the ongoing persistent beta. They have a beta right now. It's active 24/7. You can sign up if you're interested. That's it for today. Yeah, I know yes, animations look janky, especially that melee combat, but even the shooting and the movement looks a little, it's a stiffness, and I hope they can make it feel more fluid. But more so, even if it does look stiff, if it feels good to play, which we won't know until we play, if it feels good, doesn't really much matter, honestly. Can't wait to check it out. That's all for today. Thanks as always for watching. Hope you enjoyed. See you next time.